So I just tried launching the poll everywhere inside of WebEx. Can somebody give me a thumbs up or put something in the chat? Let me know if that worked for you. All right, cool. I see a hand, so that's a good sign. Awesome. My cunning plan was to go directly into another slide, but I made a mistake, and so let me fix it, and then we'll move into the slide. Well, welcome. My best laid plans of making that all go really smoothly didn't quite happen, but hopefully we got everything worked out now. So thanks for coming today. We're going to be talking about the curse of the testing pyramid. And to do that, we're going to look at some history of curses on tombs that were discovered in Egypt, talk about that a little bit, and then look at maybe what that can tell us about human nature and how we approach testing. So let's talk a little bit about particularly we're going to be talking about Tutankhamun's tomb in Egypt. So in the Valley of the Pharaohs, there was this tomb discovered in 1920. Let's see, I think it was 1924, and here's a news article from the time. So they found this tomb, and they're going to go get in the tomb. And actually, after they found it, they go back to the day after they opened the tomb. This is a news article, I believe, from the New York Times, because they had an agreement with the New York Times to be the only paper that was there. So after they opened the tomb, they went back to their house or wherever they were staying, and the main archaeologist on this, his name was Carter. He had brought a canary with him because he was lonely there, and the canary helped keep him company. Anyway, when they got back, they heard this noise, and the canary was being attacked by a snake. A snake had somehow gotten in the cage, so they got the snake away from the canary, and the canary was not killed by the snake's fangs. The canary just died of fright. So, and then some people started pointing out that the type of snake that was on it was the same one that was on the crowns of the two statues that were outside of us. So there was like suspicious things around us. So here's a picture of at the top of the tomb. I think this is before they actually went down in it. The archaeologist right there is Carter. He's the one that had the canary. And these two other people are Lord, I'm going to try to say it correctly, Lord Carnarvon and his daughter. So they were there, and they were there at the opening of the tomb. As a matter of fact, I think they went in, they found the tomb, and they were going to wait for the Egyptian authorities and people to get there. But once they got everybody away from it, they went in themselves late that night to see what was actually there. And I want to point out here that all these people here, he is deceased, and they're all deceased. All of them have died. Now, is that a coincidence? I don't know. You be the judge. But we'll go through and look at some of the things that happen there. So this is Lord Carnarvon. He was he funded a lot of the stuff that was happening over there. Here he is in where he's buried on his estate in England, and the way that he died was interesting. He was in Egypt, and he actually died in Egypt, and they brought him back to England. But he was shaving himself, and he cut himself where he had been bitten by a mosquito, got infected from that, died of blood poisoning, and then they brought him back to England. Well, later, after they started looking at King Tut, they realized that he had a mark on his face where they think that Lord Carnarvon had cut himself. They didn't dig Lord Carnarvon up to actually check. Probably a good thing. But that was part of the mystery of it, was this a suspicious way that he died. Now, if Lord Carnarvon, he may sound familiar, and if he does, it's probably because of this. This is where he lived. Does this look familiar to anyone? Anyone recognize this place from television? So this is actually Highclere Castle, and you may know it as Downton Abbey. Yes, Downton Abbey. So this is what they used for filming of that. And matter of fact, that TV show is probably one of the main reasons they're able to do we're able to do some renovations on it today. When the basement of this place is actually a Egyptian museum of a bunch of artifacts and stuff that they had brought back. Okay, so Lord Carnarvon dies, and so lots of suspicions are flowing around. So this is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, so Sherlock Holmes fame, and he attributed Lord Carnarvon's death to the elementals that were protecting this tomb. Now, Doyle also had some, I think it was probably the previous year, he had been involved in the Coddington Ferry mystery, where some girls had reported seeing fairies and then taking pictures of fairies. And then some people showed up, gave them cameras, and they started producing about 5 different pictures of fairies. And Doyle popularized that a lot because he referenced it in some things that he was writing. The two cousins that did this later on, I think in the 80s, admitted, so this was, I think, 1921. In the 80s, they admitted that they had staged these, done cutouts and made the things, taken pictures of it. Except for one of them maintained that the last picture they had taken actually had fairies and that they had indeed seen fairies. So this was another thing just kind of going around that time period. Another interesting story kind of around this was Sir Bruce Ingram. Carter gave him, so the archaeologist gave him a mummified hand as a paperweight, and which I don't understand entirely. I mean, I have some things on my desk, but the hand, like a severed hand off something, is not the type of thing I would want on my desk. Anyway, Bruce Ingram had this in his house, and but the hand actually had an inscription written around it, and it said, "Cursed be he who moves my body; to him shall come fire, water, and pestilence." Well, Sir Ingram had this in his house and had it there for a while, and suddenly there was a giant flood, and it destroyed, or fire, and it destroyed his house, and he had to rebuild his house. Okay, so check, we got the fire. They rebuilt the house after the fire, and then there was a flood, which destroyed a bunch of stuff in the house. So check, we've got the water. By this time, Sir Ingram got rid of it. He was like, okay, enough of that. I'm not gonna wait around to see what the pestilence looks like. So this was deemed suspicious. Mussolini, so around this time, had a bunch of mummies in his, or a number of mummies in his royal palace. And after he heard about these things happening, he had them taken out of the palace because he decided it was not worth the risk. Okay, so based on what we've said so far, what do you think about the idea of there being a curse? So a vote. Options are, there definitely was a curse on that tomb, or B, there probably wasn't a curse, but people believed, so they tended to die sooner based on their expectations. No curse, people just paid attention to bad things to reinforce the idea of a curse. Or D, I'm not saying it was aliens were involved, but it definitely had aliens involved. So what do you vote for? Okay, so we got quite a few people, 16%, say we think there actually was a curse on that tomb. C, we've got the biggest one here, though, is no curse. People were just paying attention to bad things to reinforce the idea of a curse. We've got, 7% of us, or it's aliens, and 8% saying probably wasn't cursed, but people believed it, so they tended to die sooner based on expectations. So people have gone through and studied this, which I find interesting. It's like, you know what we're going to do? We're going to study the people that died after being in Tutankhamun's opening his grave. But they've studied it and said statistically people didn't associated with the opening of the tomb didn't actually die any earlier. So that brings up a question, what was driving the idea of the curse? So here's this picture again. Now, one of the interesting things about Tutankhamun's grave is it was one of the graves of the pharaohs that actually did not have a curse on it. That was the one thing that was kind of unique about it, is most of the graves did have curses, but this one didn't. So the thing actually driving this, though, was Lord Carnarvon had sold the rights to the New York Times to be the first people to enter into the tomb, or be the people to report on it. So they kind of wanted to keep everybody else away from it. They didn't, once they found it, they didn't want grave robbers coming in taking things out. So what they did to help do that is they started spreading the idea of a curse just to help keep people away. And the point I want to where I want to kind of go with this is they had a story that was being used to help influence behavior. Stories can influence behavior, and sometimes we forget to ask if they are actually true. In this case, there was the story of the curse was being spread, even though there wasn't actually a curse on this particular grave. And 100 years later, there's still people looking at that, trying to figure out if there actually was a curse, if people were more likely to die or not. So it's amazing how prevalent and how long-lasting a good story will be. So let's talk about testing. And I'm going to make just a quick change here. I realized one thing did not get set up right, so give me just 1 second to make sure we're dealing with some of the, I see we're getting results from previous polls, and I want to see what this particular group is saying. So just one moment here. It's amazing how, despite best planning, the number of things that cannot get set up correctly. Okay, so let me reset this and then we'll be all set. to see what this group thinks and not included with the last one. Okay, so here's the question. When it comes to testing, what does your team discuss the most often? What is your team discussing as a team? Are they talking about the testing pyramid? Is that something you hear mentioned a lot? The return on investment the tests are providing to the customer? Complaining how long the tests take? Or complaining that the tests are broken again? And let me throw that in here. Oh, you know what? That's not showing up for you, is it? Let me try this. That work? There we go. I think that. Sorry about that. Okay, so the testing pyramid, return on investment tests are providing, complaining about how long the tests take, or complaining that the tests are broken again. And these are all things I have heard discussed. Okay, so it looks like most of us are kind of in this area right here of C and D. None of the above. Okay. If you've got something else, feel free to throw it in the chat. I'd love to hear what your team is doing, or maybe you're saying they don't have any tests, so it's not even part of the discussion. I would like to suggest though that if B is not what your team's talking about, they're probably, if the focus isn't on the return on investment, there's probably ways to improve your testing strategy in the way that your team utilizes testing. So let's look at kind of a brief history of testing. And kind of what we're going to do here is lay out the story that may be driving some of the things that your team is doing, particularly when it comes to testing pyramid. So this is how a lot of development work would oftentimes gets done. So you kind of do requirements, do development, and then do manual testing. And this is very much kind of a waterfall approach. But even if you're doing this within sprints, you may have something that looks something like this. We're going to figure out what we're going to do it, and then we're going to test and see if we actually did it. So in this type of layout, what happens a lot of times is right here, you spend a lot of time waiting for manual testing. We do all this development work, and then we throw it over the wall to other people, and they're going to let us know whether we built what we intended to build. And this can take a very long time waiting for that. And it doesn't give you rapid feedback. So the logical thing to do is let's find a tool to automate this. And this was kind of a big push in testing for a while, where we said, okay, we're going to use some type of UI recording. So HP Test Center, I'm not sure what they call it now. I think it used to be called Mercury. Selenium is a way to automate that. Different ways of trying to go in and say, okay, we're going to go, all these buttons and stuff we have to click, we're going to have some way of recording that or scripting it out, and then we'll just play it back against it to see if it's working. And then everyone lived happily ever after, right? That's what happened. So, but actually they didn't. But quick question: what best describes your experience with recording UI interactions and playing them back to test the software? So the idea of saying we're going to record what the user does, and then we can play it back over and over again as many times as we want. Okay, so A, we've got people do that, like that's even possible. No one's voting for it, works great. C, we've got about 23% of us, quarter of us or so, saying it's useful as long as there's few enough to make it easy to maintain. Okay. D, kind of useful, but they break and take a long time to fix. Or E, they usually end up breaking and no one fixes them, so they just get turned off. And D looks like it's most popular one here. So everyone lived happily ever after, except for they didn't. Like no one's saying that this is just the most awesome thing that they've ever experienced. So previously, when we were doing the manual testing, we were waiting for people to do the tests. Now we've just replaced that with waiting for people to update the test. Automating those tests in that way doesn't actually fundamentally change the way that we're doing the development. We've just replaced one thing, waiting for people to do the test, with waiting for them to update the automated test. Now that may still be an improvement, but it's not a marked difference kind of in the flow of how we're doing our work. So these types of UI tests that we've described are usually slow to run. They can be hard to tie a failed test back to the change because you've probably made a bunch of changes before you hand it over and let people try to go ahead and figure out how to automate it. And UI tests are often very, very brittle. If you're just recording user interactions, or I've even seen some things where you run your browser through a proxy and the proxy records it. If that's the approach you're taking, and then the developer's like, oh, you know what, this particular, the name we gave to this class in HTML needs to be something else, and so they update it because that's a good refactoring to do, and it breaks all your tests, it kind of pushes you away from doing refactoring because it's a very brittle approach to things. Okay, so that's what is. What might be? Like, what could we possibly imagine that might be fast to run, easy to tie to a failed test back to the change, and that's not brittle, something that we can refactor very easily? So meanwhile, while this was kind of taking place, we had test-driven development starting to take hold. So developers finding that using tests to drive their development was a good way to do development work. So now over on the development, we've got test-driven development happening over there. And it just so happens that the tests you usually write for test-driven development are usually very fast to run because they're just testing like a method or a function at a time. They're usually pretty easy to tie a failed test back to the change because you're getting feedback so quickly you don't change a lot of stuff before you run the tests and make sure everything works. And they're not usually as brittled because usually the way that we're testing stuff with TDD is tied to the actual method in a way that we can refactor stuff and update all of our tests because we're actually calling the method. That's not usually the case when you're reaching out into the UI because you don't actually have type checking around it. But the downside is this doesn't actually test the user experience. So TDD very much is focused on what the developer expects the application to do, but it doesn't go in and say, okay, when a user comes in, what's a user going to do this? And this is in general. I've seen people try to do that as part of TDD. Usually that starts getting over into more behavior-driven development. Okay, so this is kind of the place that we found ourselves. So we've got some tests that are fast to run, easy to tie a failed test back to the change, not brittle, so that's the TDD stuff. Then we've got these other things that do things in the UI that are slow to run, hard to tie a failed test back to the change, and the UI tests are very, very brittle. So here's an idea. Let's do more of this and less of this down here. And that is how we came to the story behind the testing pyramid, which is the idea that we're going to have user interface tests, integration tests, and unit tests, and we want to have fewer of the ones up top and a whole lot more of the ones down below. So if we break those up, the user interface tests are the ones that test what the user touches and see. They're usually created by the testing team when you're dealing with things that are in most discussions where people are talking about testing pyramids. They replicate what somebody would be likely to do with manual testing. They're usually brittle and hard to refactor, and they're often very, very slow to run. It takes a long time to get the feedback from them. Integration tests are kind of in that middle. They test the way that things integrate. They often don't touch the UI. As a matter of fact, most times they don't touch the UI. They don't always use the user's point of view, though. So it's more of kind of how things fit together than how the user experiences it. They're usually easier to refactor than UI tests, but not, oftentimes it's a little bit harder to refactor them than, depending on how your application is put together, a little bit harder to refactor them than just the TDD tests. And they run moderately quickly. All right, I said TDD test, the unit test. So unit tests are very small tests at the method level. They never touch the UI, or in most cases, they don't touch the UI. They don't integrate. It usually doesn't integrate parts. So you don't necessarily even have to have the database stood up or any of that stood up for it. It's just calling the methods. And as a result, they generally run very, very quickly. So that builds kind of our testing pyramid. And this was based on how development was being done and the tools we had available. This was kind of the common thought or the common story being told, which was, okay, let's make sure we spend a lot of time on the unit test. We get really fast, a little less on the integration test, and have as few as we need of the user interface tests. Like, we think we still need them, but we don't want very many of those tests because they're expensive and all those things. But then, some things changed. First, we got new tools. There were new ways of doing things that weren't necessarily there back when we were experiencing the pain that drove us to having that idea of the testing pyramid. We also found new patterns for doing testing. We'll talk about some of those in a little bit. And the cloud, that introduced a very different way of doing things to where we'll look at this in just a second, but instead of buying a computer the capacity we need to run all the time, we can buy just what we need to run in 30 minutes and then shut it down and not pay for all that other time that we don't need it. So that introduces some very different trade-offs than what maybe we had when we went through what we just talked about. So which question seems most useful in deciding whether you should create a test or not? So A, what shape is made if I were to represent my test with Lego blocks? Or what return on investment would I get from this test? Okay, well, we've got 10% that think the shape is the most important thing. And if you can't tell, what I'm nudging us here toward is thinking more about what's the return we get from this rather than what shape it would make with Lego blocks. And maybe people are voting for A just because they really like Legos, and that's cool too. But generally, though, what I want to suggest and want us thinking about, though, is what's the value we're actually getting from a test? Because if we're focused on that, it might lead us in things that get us away from stories that were told decades ago that we're still living with, which is kind of what happened with the Tutankhamun's tomb. Okay, so that brings us to the curse of the testing pyramid, right? We've been talking about the curse of Tutankhamun's tomb. Now we're going to talk about the curse of the testing pyramid, or things that could go wrong, maybe lead us astray if we get too focused on the idea of the shape of our test. So curse number 1, trying to create a shape instead of the value. So if I ask myself, what return on investment do I get from each test? That's probably going to push me, that may push me in a different direction than if I ask, what shape is I made if I were to represent my test with Lego blocks? And it doesn't mean that you won't end up with a testing pyramid, but trying to create a testing pyramid with your test is a very different thing than being driven by the value, and it just happens to create a testing pyramid. So as an example, let's consider this. So this is traditional bell curve. This represents the distribution of IQ in a society, right? It's a normal distribution. If you test enough people, you'll end up with this curve. But what happens every year, though, the IQ is actually going up. Like if you wanted to find a bunch of people with lower, a huge group of people with lower IQ than the people that you can go and test on the street today, just go back to previous generation or two, right? And you'll go down. I think it's about 3% per decade, if I remember right. So, but imagine this. What if in our education system, when we think about nutrition, all the things that go into making people smart, and good at doing things, what if this curve, we're like, the IQ is normally distributed, it's curved like this. What if we started finding that this curve was shifting, which is what we find. We shift it, and instead of being centered around 100, it's now centered around 103 or something. What should our response be to that? Should our response be, we need to find some way to make sure that more of the people up here are over there? Like, how can we dumb down the population to make sure we still produce this shape? That would be nonsense. What they actually do is they end up updating the curve. They rebase the IQ test. But I would like to suggest, though, that if we're very, very focused on the testing pyramid and trying to achieve a testing pyramid, it would be like trying to dumb down some of the population in order to make sure it's still centered around a particular score. Imagine that you're a teacher of a class and you start finding that you're not producing this bell curve. It's, for some reason, you've got everybody over here, like people are doing really, really well. It's not normally distributed. That would be a good thing, right? You don't try to redo things in your class to try to make it evenly distributed again. You celebrate that you're actually achieving something. So what shape provides the most value for your application? And that's a very different question than trying to say we're trying to create a testing pyramid. So is it a square? Is it a triangle? What if we could do a pear? Is a pear shape better for our application, or maybe a strawberry? If banana-shaped tests provide greater value, then you should have banana-shaped tests. And shout out to Banana Man that's on here. So the point is that the shape of the test probably should, it might be interesting to look at, but that shouldn't be driving your decisions about what to test and what not to test. So curse number 2. Curse number 2. Somebody have a comment? Okay, cool. Curse number 2, believing what was slow in 2006 is necessarily slow today. So here's a quote from Martin Fowler, and he said, the pyramid is based on the assumption that broad stack tests are expensive, slow, and brittle compared to more focused tests such as unit tests. And this is, I really like this quote because it's calling out, here's the reason that people were saying when we do our test, based on these assumptions, we end up with a pyramid. And we've got another quote from here in a little bit. But if these assumptions are no longer true, we probably shouldn't still be doing something that over a decade ago or 2 decades ago may have made perfect sense. We ought to be updating as the facts change. So here's an example. Let's say you got 1,000 UI tests that take 2 minutes each. Okay, and you're running that. You've got a computer. You've got all these tests, and you're running those on a computer, and you discover that takes 33 hours to run. So if that's the case, you're probably not going to make a little 2-line change and then wait 33 hours to get the feedback. Now you might do, maybe you let it run overnight or whatever, or you only do it at the end of after you've done all your development work and you're getting ready to go live. But that's going to influence how you behave. It may influence how much time you spend creating tests. You might have more tests that go all the way through something, testing an entire process. Oh, my arm disappears. Okay, testing an entire process. And fewer tests that just go in, set everything up, test one really small thing. So that's way too slow. And these numbers are, I think, roughly accurate from a project I was working on years ago. But what if, so that's way too slow, but what if those tests were actually valuable? Well, nowadays we have the ability, and in this particular case, what they did is they brought up 4 servers with 20 containers, and those 1,000 UI tests that took 2 minutes each could now run in 25 minutes and they'd get the feedback. So if we're able to change, like Martin Fowler was saying, if some of those, it's based on these assumptions. If we have technology to change those assumptions, we probably ought to be willing to take a different approach, or at least it's no longer a constraint, right? And if there is value from having more of a particular type of test, we don't want to not do it just because it doesn't make the shape of a banana or a pear or whatever shape we're having to think we're targeting. The cost and speed of running tests look very different now than it did back in 2006. Curse number 3, ignoring improved ways of doing development. So the pyramid was created as a response to UI tests being recorded by a team of testers. So in other words, you had people going in and they were doing usually some type of recording software or some very labor-intensive scripting, and then trying to play that back. And they were getting code thrown over the wall to them and working on it there. One of the big things that has changed is bringing BDD into and saying, hey, you know what? When we have developers that are using test-driven development to drive the methods they're creating, if we have behavior-driven development and from the outside in, they're using that to drive how they are to make sure that what they're building is actually what the customer has said they want, against examples of what the customer wants. This is a very, very different way of doing development. Oops. Where was I? Okay, so ignoring improved ways of doing development is what we're talking about. So BDD represents a fundamentally different way of doing development. We should probably expect, if we dramatically change the way we do development, that some of the stories we told ourselves 2 decades ago might look a little bit different. And we just want to make sure that we're still getting at the value of what we're trying to deliver through our testing, and not just, you know, you've got Carter and Lord Carnarvon telling a story and we stick with that for the next 100 years. So behavior-driven development, it leverages test-driven development, but with 2 loops, right? We got this inner loop of doing test-driven development, creating unit tests the way that the developers think about it. But then we've got this outer loop of driving the behavior of how the application works and what the user expects to experience. You end up with the requirements as executable specifications. It's all driven from the user's point of view, and developers write the test back in code. Which, notice before I was saying we give people stuff and say, we give testers things and say, okay, go in and actually record all this stuff. In this case, the developers are actually writing that as they're developing the application, hopefully working in pairs. So you got 2 people looking at it and you got testers giving input to it, but it's happening as you're writing the application instead of something that happens after the fact. Another change in technology that we have, or a change in way of doing things, is the page object pattern, which represents a way to, I think in a few months we're going to actually use some examples of this, but it represents your application as an abstraction instead of trying to test stuff by remembering which ID or class to go in and click on. So it makes it a lot easier to deal with your refactoring than what you'd have if you're actually recording stuff. So this solves many of the brittleness problems if you're using the page object pattern effectively. Okay, so those things mentioned. So let's talk about so where does this leave us? We've talked about the curses. So some summaries of what we talked about. So don't try to create a pyramid. If your tests happen to be shaped like a pyramid, based on what you're delivering and that you're delivering value, and that's how it happens to be shaped, that's great. But that shouldn't be what you're trying to deliver, is tests that look like a pyramid. Do enable the delivery of valuable software. So if I can deliver more valuable software or tests shaped like a banana, whatever that might mean, that should be just fine, and I shouldn't be worried about whether it's shaped like a pyramid or not. Your tests might form a pyramid, or they might not. Another quote from Martin Fowler says, I restored this. This wasn't Martin Fowler. This is something I overheard. And they said, we've got too many UI tests. Let's delete some of them so our tests are shaped more like a pyramid and run faster. And there may very well be a good reason to delete some of your UI tests. If you've got things that don't actually provide any value, then by all means, go ahead and delete them. But the reason to delete them should not be because they take a long time. If they're actually valuable, you probably should find some way to go ahead and run them faster. You've got lots of tools at your disposal to do that didn't exist 10 years ago. But that's what we should be trying to do, is find out how to go ahead and get value from our tests, not just delete them. Now, if they're not valuable, absolutely, go ahead and delete the tests. But the way they're shaped or the fact they're running slow are not good reasons to delete them. The reasons to delete them would be they're not adding any value to our process. Okay, so what shape are tests on your current project? Or do you know, right? If you think about your current project, what shape are the tests you have today? So somebody was asking, what's an example of a UI test? So what I'm using as an example of a UI test here would be something like, when I log into the system as an admin user, then I see the admin menu, right? That would be a UI test, because you've got to go in, you've got to actually click through on stuff to see what's there. So you'd have something that fills out a login of some type in your test environment or in the local machine. It clicks on login, it goes to the page, it looks at the menu, makes sure that that menu is there. So anything that would be stuff that the user is the way the user would experience the application. And whether or not it's done by the tester, a lot of times it is done by the tester, and it's something that you're giving to testers and they're writing scripts against. I haven't seen that be very good for the long-term evolution of applications. Behavior-driven development kind of combines that into the development process, still uses the input from testers, but it combines it as part of the way that you're doing development. And I've seen some places where people came from a testing background, but they had good dev skills, and they basically shifted over. They're still bringing all their dev expertise to the process, but they're now helping write the code and write the testing code as part of the development instead of something that happens after the fact. Okay, so what tests? Okay, 34% of us, a third of us are saying, okay, we don't have any tests at all. 20% are saying we actually do make a pyramid. And if that's how you're getting the most value, that's absolutely great, right? But that probably you shouldn't be creating a pyramid and forgetting about how you're actually delivering value. The inverted pyramid, which would be where you've got lots of UI tests and maybe not as many unit level tests. And there obviously can be problems with that, right? If you're not getting rapid feedback from your application because it takes so long to run the UI and you don't get quick feedback on anything, then that might be an indication that, oh, it's because we're investing so much time in the UI tests. It might be an indication that you just need to start adding TDD tests. You may not need to delete anything. You may need to add spend more time making sure you're actually following the TDD process. Now, I've been on teams where they got so much value out of behavior-driven development and their feedback was so quick that they didn't invest as much time in the test-driven. They used test-driven development to drive the development, but didn't end up with as many tests in that space just because they got such fast feedback from the behavior-driven development. So 16% say rectangle. An hourglass might be something if you're using behavior-driven development and you're using test-driven development or really focused on those, you might find, and you've got fast feedback, you might find that the behavior-driven development does a lot of what you'd be testing at the integration level, and so it's redundant for you. Banana, just because it's fun to say. Okay, we got 13% there. So once again, if banana-shaped tests provide greater value, then you should definitely have banana-shaped test. BDD and TDD enable a new way of developing code. You may end up with more UI tests than what you'd have in a traditional pyramid if you're focused on the value and you've now got new tools at your disposal. So if you're asking yourself, instead of what shape is my test, but asking yourself, how do I prove this does what the user wants, you'll probably find a really good balance. Particularly if you're asking, how do I prove the way this does what the user wants, and how do I make sure I've got rapid feedback? One thing I hear people talking about, like looking at the code coverage. And so there's similar discussion to the testing pyramid on the idea of code coverage. So you have to, we've got to have 88% code coverage, or 70% code coverage, or 95% code coverage, or whatever it is. And those can be useful tools. It's nice to see how much code coverage you've got of things, but we should probably be driving our development more on what's my confidence that nothing's broken. If I have 99% code coverage, but only 10% confidence that everything works correctly, that's not a good situation. On the other hand, if I have 90% confidence that everything works okay, but I'm at 50% code coverage because of however it works, that's a better situation to be in, right? Because I can have lots of code coverage, but no confidence. I'd rather have the confidence that this change I make, I can deploy because I know it's going to work. The way you test your software. So this is a statement. I'm curious what people think about this, but the way you test your software is the most important thing in determining how long that software will be able to evolve. And I say this based on working on a lot of projects and kind of the idea that legacy code is code that you don't have tests for. And I think that was something Michael Feathers originally said, but I think it rings very true, because once you get to the point that you cannot test the application and get feedback quickly, it is very expensive to make a small change. And once you get to the point that it's expensive to make a small change, you will not refactor things when they need refactored. So you'll try to find the way to make changes without fixing stuff as you find it. And so then you just kind of build upon, it just builds upon itself of code that has not evolved as you learn new things. And so if you have a good way to test your software that gives you rapid feedback and high confidence that everything works, you're in a position to where you never end up with legacy code because you're able to just continue to adapt it going forward. I'd worked on a treasury project and it had been live for 5 years, and I wasn't on the project anymore, but I met with some of the people that had been there when I was, and I said, how's it going? And they said that their management had come to them and said, hey, this has been live for about 5 years. This is usually the point where we start asking, start planning for a rewrite, because that's just what our experience has been with software overall. And they said, they had told management, yeah, we're not actually there, because anything we need to do, we can change. And the reason they could do that is because they had invested so heavily in testing. So they could continue to make changes, and they continue to invest in testing. They could continue to make changes to the application without being in a position where, oh, well, we can't change that because we can't prove. They were able to make really small changes to the application and continue to grow it toward what they needed. So they didn't need to plan on doing a rewrite. So here's another quote by Martin Fowler. He says, if my high-level tests are fast, reliable, and cheap to modify, then lower-level tests aren't needed. And I think this is a really good thing to keep in our mind, because what Martin Fowler is pointing to here is, what value do the tests provide? And if we're driven by that and we find ways that we can get feedback really, really quickly on whether the application works, it might not look like, it might make sense to have, he's saying you might not need any lower level tests. Maybe you do need lower level tests in certain areas. But the thing that should be driving you is, can you get tests that are fast, reliable, and cheap to modify? One thing I've seen happen a lot with behavior-driven development is you're going through and like, okay, as a user, I log in as this, and I do this, and I do this, and I do these other things, and I make sure this flow works all the way through. But then you've got a requirement to test 100 different combinations of those things all the way through. Well, you may discover that, hey, we're going to have our UI test that goes through and tests 4 or 5 of these things, or the most common cases that they may, make sure that the error messages come back correctly. But then we have other tests that are just testing the algorithm behind it that tests all the different inputs. And those run really, really fast because they're happening at the integration level, or maybe even more at the unit test level. And I think that's a good example of saying, is this fast, reliable, and cheap to modify? Is kind of saying, okay, I've got this stuff up here. Maybe I don't want to put 1,000 different combinations up in the UI level tests. And you very well may find that if you're doing that, you end up with something that looks like a pyramid. But the pyramid shape shouldn't be what's driving it. So this is very much what Aaron Fowler is describing here, is very much focused on the value of the tests, not just, oh, we should have this many of this or this many of that. So I mentioned several times here the BDD and TDD. Let me just show you the diagram. We've got other talks that we'll do that will get more into this. But with BDD, we've got this outer loop here of talking about writing a scenario. So the way that a user is going to experience our software. That scenario should fail. We'll then make it executable. Then we'll get into our TDD loop over here and thinking about, okay, let's write a simple test, watch it fail, write code to make it pass, and this is happening at the method level. And if we do that enough times, we eventually get to the point that that scenario passes, and we get back up to the top, and we start on the next scenario. So that's what the BDD loop, and when I said the TDD loop inside of the BDD loop looks like. And if this sounds interesting, be watching for something, or feel free to email me and let me know, and I'll try to bring one of those talks forward instead of in the next few months. So the curse of King Tut's tomb was just a story. There wasn't even a curse on that particular tomb. The story actually created the curse. And is the story of the testing pyramid creating a curse for your team? Is the story of the testing pyramid pushing you away from actually thinking about the value of your tests and letting the value of your tests drive your decisions in how you do your testing? Okay, so we got two more things we're going to do here. Oh, good. We're doing good on time. I'm going to get some feedback from you in just a minute, or I want to give you an update on what's coming up, some opportunities if you want some, if you're interested in having me work with your team. Then we're going to do a contest and we will give away a t-shirt. So we've got those things happening. The other thing I want to mention is in the invite, I said that if you pass the invite on to other people and they come to the best ability of my system to track, we've got a t-shirt coming to you. So I don't have those stats where I can pull them up, but I'll pull them up after this talk. If we had somebody that got multiple people here, we'll have a t-shirt headed your way as a winner. So be watching for that. I will send you an email if you're the winner of that. Okay, so I'd like just ask, just hypothetically, what is the value of a 5% increase in your team's efficiency? And I think a lot of times we don't, this is something that we overlook how big that would be for a team of, 5, 10 people. That's pretty significant. Or even a 3%, 2%, or even a 1% increase in efficiency, that could be a huge deal for your team. My work is going into teams, usually working with them hands-on every single day. And we can do some really, really cool things with that, but sometimes that's a hard sell for management stuff. And I want to mention, I've got some kind of subscription type programs that I'm putting together to where I'm coming in once a week, attending one stand-up, having multiple coaching sessions that you and you can come to, or you can decide how you want to allocate those in your team. And then also doing like a training session each week based on how we want to move things forward. So I've got some of these things out there. If this sounds interesting to you and you're like, hey, we'd like to have Mark, but we can't just afford to have him here full time, reach out to me and I'll get you some pricing on this. And we talk through what it would look like, come up with something, particularly if you're toward the end of the year and you've got some training budget that might be available. Let's talk and see if there's some ways that I may be able to help your team with some of these things. Okay. Presentation feedback. We're going to spend 90 seconds doing this, so I'll pull that up here. And while we do that, let me, let's see here. Okay, I'll put this in here too. Please give me feedback on this. I'd like to hear what you guys think of this talk. The feedback's very, very helpful. So fill that out. I'll just let you know, next week we're going to be talking about effective onboarding. A friend of mine suggested this. We're going to talk about how to successfully add team members to your team. Some things that work well, maybe some things that don't work as well. On the, let's see, this is going to be the 21st, Pratik and Dan are going to be joining us. They've both got books coming out. We've had them on separately before, but Pratik is talking about Scaling Simplified. I'm about third way through that book. It's been really, really good so far. Dan's going to be talking about metrics for making your teams predictable. So we're going to get together, have a conversation. They're going to present some stuff to us. Very excited about that. And then on the 28th, we've got Chris Stone joining us to talk about retrospective masterclass. So he's going to be talking about leveling up your continuous improvement game. Chris has all kinds of very interesting ways of doing retrospective. So this should be a fun talk. So be watching for that. Okay, so 90 seconds to fill out the presentation while we listen to some intense music. up. So click the last button there. If it didn't get all filled out, that's great. Thank you for the people that filled it out. This is very, very useful to me. So I appreciate that. You thought responding to the survey gets us a t-shirt. No, I don't have the capability to produce them quite at that scale or the shipping involved in that. But good idea. Maybe we'll try that sometime. Okay, Curse of the Testing Pyramid competitive quiz. Okay, we're going to talk about what we did. And one of the great things I love about doing this is it helps us just kind of think back of what was said, even if you disagree with some of it. You'll remember, oh, Mark said this and I disagree with that. That's fine too. But let's we'll look through this. I think we got 6 or 7 questions. Okay. So let's start. What happened to Carter's canary after the tomb was open? Did it fly away? Did it die in the coal mine? Was it scared to death? Or was it swallowed by a serpent? So what happened to Howard Carter's canary after the tomb was opened? 5 seconds left. And yes, it was scared to death by a serpent, right? The serpent tried to eat it and it scared it to death. So those are very close. I like that. It died in a coal mine. But yes, okay, Andy, I've got lots of people top spot. Very good. Okay, we'll see if we can winnow this down. What is one major difference in the way tests run now than the way they ran in the past? Is it that all tests are cursed because they were run in an Egyptian tomb? Is that the cloud and containers let you run more tests faster and in parallel? Screen recording software no longer makes brittle tests? We can hire Martians to run all the tests, or we no longer have to test anything in the UI. So what is one major difference in the way tests run now than the way they ran in the past? And yes, the cloud and containers let you run more tests faster and in parallel. So those are the we can do things a lot more rapidly now without necessarily having to have a huge server. We can just bring up exactly what we need, massive server, run a bunch of stuff, and then tear it down. If somebody does have a way, the 4% of you that said we can hire Martians to run all our tests, reach out to me. I want to find out how to do that. That sounds pretty interesting. Okay. Oh, we're starting to break things up. We've got Krister, followed by Jason, Famita, and Dead Ringer. All right. Okay, what was a key benefit of behavior-driven development? Is it that better screen recording software? Faster computers? Tests written by developers? Testing is now taught in colleges. You don't have to refactor your tests, or tests don't fail very often. Key benefit of BDD. And this was mentioned in passing. I may not spend a lot of time talking about this. And yes, tests were written by developers. And so the reason that is beneficial is because then you've got this tight integration, and it means that there's not waiting for someone else to do it. So the developers are writing stuff and trying to make sure it passes right then, and they're getting rapid feedback instead of saying, oh, test didn't work, I bet that they need to update their tests. And so then they go on and start another story. They get the feedback right. If tests are broken, they need to fix it as part of it instead of kind of just tossing that over the wall to someone else. Okay, Krista retains the top spot, followed by Dead Ringer, Jason, Jennifer C. What is a key technique to make tests less brittle? A key technique to make tests less brittle. Page objects, JUnit, cloud technologies, or Kubernetes. So we mentioned this is a way to make particularly unit tests UI tests less brittle. It's something, it's an approach that makes it a lot less brittle, makes it easier to make changes. And yes, page objects. So JUnit, cloud technology, Kubernetes are all very useful things, but page objects is the thing that lets you kind of insulate your testing from the way that the page happens to appear. So page objects will let you say, okay, log into the application, and then if you change the mechanism that logs in, you don't have to go to every single test that logs in. The page object abstracts that away, so you can just change it in the page object. Okay, we got Jason top spot, followed by Andy, Mark, and Tom. BDD represents what? What does BDD represent? Does it represent an improvement to test-driven development? A fundamentally different way of doing development? Improvement to TDD, fundamentally different way of doing development, a curse brought on us from Tutankhamun's tomb, an alternative to TDD, the way to follow safe, or a drop-in replacement for HPALM. Did not let people vote? Okay, there may have been a problem with that one. Okay, well, still same as before. Okay, skip that one. What shape did Mark say test should be? What shape did Mark say test should be? Hopefully I'll let you vote now. Should it be square, dragon fruit, hexagon, ice cream cone, or don't worry about the shape, think about the value the tests provide? One more second. Okay, hopefully that worked. Good, okay. Yes, don't worry about the shape. Think about the value the tests provide. Dragon fruit would be a really cool shape for tests, but that may not be the most valuable thing for your particular application. Okay, we've got Jason, Andy, Tom, Mark. Next question. What is not an upcoming Agile Lunch and Learn talk? So which of these is not an upcoming Agile Lunch and Learn talk? There and Back Again, Returning to Safe After an Unlikely Adventure by Mr. Baggins on the 14th. Retrospective Masterclass by Chris Stone on 11/28. 2.5 Books by Pratik and Dan on 11/21. Or Effective Onboarding by Mark Shedd, 11/7, which is not an upcoming Agile Lunch and Learn talk. And yes, Bilbo Baggins is not going to be talking to us about returning to safe. Although if people are really interested, we might be able to come up with a talk around that. But yes, next week we're going to be talking about effective onboarding. We're going to be talking about that, so hopefully that'll be interesting for everyone. Okay, and our winner is Mark M, followed by Tom. Ooh, very, very close here. So Mark, send me an email or do a screenshot of that if you want. I'll probably know it's you anyway. Send me an email and we will get and your email with your address and your t-shirt size, and we will get a t-shirt headed your way. Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming. I will stick around for a few minutes. If anyone has anything they want to chat about, I appreciate it. And feel free to reach out if there's anything you want to discuss on. I mentioned we've got kind of those subscriptions for Agile coaching stuff. If that sounds interesting, send me an email. I would love to discuss it with you and see if we can find something that works really good for your organization.